on the Caribbean islands. We're moving from Central America to the Caribbean. We will talk about them overall, and then we'll talk more in depth about the bigger islands. And then at the end of the section, I'll have you guys get to choose an island and go ahead and research some more about it. Thanks. Go ahead, Tomes. Alright, so looking at just the regular history, Columbus discovered America in 1492. When he came to America, what he actually discovered was the Caribbean islands. Okay? Now the islands, there's 13 independent countries, and the rest of them are controlled by some European country. What I want you to do is read through the early history and find out which countries came over and took over some of the islands and formed colonies on these islands, okay? It's a short section on the early history. Alright, so Columbus comes over. He thinks he lands near these in these islands near India. So what does he name these islands? Because he thinks he's near India, Natalie.
West Indies.
West Indies, and because, like you said, he thinks he's there, what does he call the people that are already on these islands, Brock?
Indians.
Indians. So that's how the Indians in the Americas came to be known as Indians, because he thought that's where he was. He really wasn't. So it's now called the Caribbean Islands. So the West Indies, if you ever hear some people talking about the West Indies, they're referring to the Caribbean Islands. Okay, so which countries back in colonization time came over and started colonizing and settling here in these islands? Which country? Give me one, Eric. The Dutch, which is the Netherlands. Jimmy? Danish, which is Denmark. Cameron? The French. Dalton? English. Harmon? And one, Spain. So you've got, countries with colonies. Spanish come over, the English come over, the French, the Dutch, the Danish. Now right away, the Spanish really could have cared less about these islands. They were small little islands, so they had really small, very, very little interest. But as soon as the French and the English and the Dutch and the Danish started coming over, then they had some interest, and they started coming over and settling here as well. So these countries, this was the 1600s, 1700s, they started establishing colonies in the islands. What is a colony? What's a colony? Brock?
Like a group of people, kind of like a settlement.
Okay, yeah. That it is like a settlement, but there's something else to it that you need to know. What's important about a colony? What else can you tell me about a colony? The United States was colonies at one point. They are no longer colonies. Think about government. Mason? Not their own government. Think about who governs them. And when we were colonies, who governed us? Mason? The English. So, if we were colonies, and we had our land and we were governed by the English, what would a colony be? Mason?
Like, smaller island, country and territory that's governed by another country.
Yeah, so it's a territory that's governed by another country. So these islands and territories became colonies that were governed by other countries. Spain, England, Britain, or same thing, France, Netherlands, Denmark. Okay? When they got there, they started to farm. And what was it that they were farming immediately? What was that they were farming? Braylon? Sugarcane. And they required a lot of workers for this, so they had the Indians, what they called the Indians, working for them. But what ended up happening to the Indians after a while? Harmon? They died. They got disease and died. So the Europeans needed more workers, and who did they get to be workers now? Dalton?
They got the Africans to work as slaves.
Yeah, they started to bring over Africans, and these Africans were slaves for them and worked in the fields. Eventually, very soon actually, Africans and people of African descent started to outnumber the Europeans on the island. So that's kind of why if you were to go down to the Caribbeans today, you would see people of African descent. That's because they brought so many over They eventually outnumbered the Europeans. Okay, so big time African descent in the Caribbean islands because of the slave and the slave trade that went on. And at times, the slaves in the Caribbean, some were brought to the United States, the colonies in the U.S. Slave trade between the what they called back then the West Indies and the U.S. colonies was big. They traded slaves often because we could trade different goods that we had up in the colonies, U.S., with people down in the West Indies, or vice versa. They could trade us some good sugar cane for some people, some Africans we had up there. So it kind of worked out, but that's how you got a lot of Africans in the Caribbean islands. Okay, so that's in the 1600s, 1700s, and then you get late 1700s, and they've got that thought going through their head, and in the United States had recently gained their independence in 1776. So that idea of being free and independent sort of trickles its way down to the Caribbeans or the West Indies. If you look at the map on 71, it shows you the different countries and where they had their colonies. Spain is purple, and you can tell that Spain actually has the bigger of all the islands there. They have those big ones. And what did we say we called the bigger islands, the larger islands? Natalie?
The Greater Antilles.
Greater Antilles. And then the smaller ones that kind of go from the Virgin Islands all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago, Dalton, are called?
The
Lesser Antilles, okay?
Did they have before these two? Kind of looks purple on the bigger one.
Yeah, because Spain had Florida during that time period. They had all of Florida and the Florida Keys, yep. The United States will eventually get Florida from Spain, but it's not for a while. So, yeah, they had Florida. Spanish Florida. French had Haiti and some other smaller ones. Britain had Jamaica and then a lot of smaller ones. The Dutch had mainly small ones, and the Danish had mainly small ones. But Spain had the larger of all the islands. So I want you to take a look at independence on 71 and find out when some of these bigger countries gained their independence and how. I'll give you a little bit of time to look over that. Which country was first? Eric.
Cuba.
100 years before Cuba, there was a country that did gain its independence. Tomes?
Haiti.
Haiti. And what year was Haiti, Tomes?
In 1804.
1804. Now, how did Haiti's independence come about? Mason?
They had a slave revolt led by Toussaint Louverture. He was a slave. A few years after he gained his freedom, a slave revolt broke out in Haiti. He soon realized that the rebels did not have a very good leaders, so he went on to form his own army and proved to be a good general, and he later became a popular governor in Haiti. So he helped revolt against the government with the slaves, and they gained their independence, and all the slaves in Haiti became free. And as soon as they gained their independence, that idea of independence started to spread throughout the rest of the islands. But if you can imagine, think of the island that is smack dab next to Haiti. It got to them real quick. And what was the next country after Haiti that became independent? Shane? Cuba.
Not Cuba. Right next to Haiti. Yes, there you go. Dominican Republic in the mid-1800s. Then, like some of you said, we've got Cuba. The United States took over Cuba from Spain, and then Cuba won its independence in 1902. But what about some of the others, mainly the smaller countries? What did they say about those countries and their independence? What did they say, Gavin?
They didn't get independence until the 1940s.
Some of them didn't necessarily get their independence until after World War II, which is about 40 years later. And how did they gain their independence? Through fights? How was it gained? Natalie?
The political power transferred it peacefully.
Peacefully, so it's just like it kind of turned it over to them. But you still have countries that are not independent, and that's fine. They said towards the end of the reading, for example, islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe are still French possessions. Each has its own elected government and also represented in the French government. Most people on these islands seem not to wish for independence from their ruling countries. So there's many of those islands over in the Lesser Antilles that are not independent at all. They are still some controlled by France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Britain still controls some. So there's a lot of those small islands that are controlled still by larger countries. So I want you to think about those countries that don't want independence. And I want you to write this question down and take a little bit of time to answer it. Why might an island's people not be interested in gaining independence? Why would they not want to be independent? All right, write that question down and take a little bit of time and answer that.
What was in the last
Did you not get it all? It'd be that one right there. Why the people not want independence? Dalton?
Maybe the country that they are ruled by has a strong army and government, and they're not as strong.
Okay, their country that's ruling them has a strong army, strong government. Mason?
They might not be able to handle it by themselves.
Okay, wouldn't be able to run themselves at all. Gavin?
They may be fine with how it is ruled, or they need that country to help them out, or they do not want to start a conflict.
Yeah, conflict being big, need the assistance of another country, or just might be happy the way it is. Brock?
Maybe they just like the way things are now, and they don't want to start a war or anything to fight for independence.
Okay. What other type of assistance, besides like military assistance, do you think that countries may need that might keep them from becoming independent? Dalton?
Culture?
Well, culture wouldn't be an assistance. What kind of help would they need? Gavin?
Economy, like
Yeah, money, financial assistance. If their economy isn't very strong and they go out and become independent, they're going to be struggling big time immediately. Same with the military. If they aren't able to protect themselves, what? Costa Rica doesn't have an army, you were right, and they are doing just fine. Where do they put most of their money? Education and healthcare, and they're perfectly fine, which is good. It's nice. So, but for instance, Belize, if they were to become independent from Britain, they would get taken over most likely from Guatemala the day they became independent, because Guatemala tends to think that everything is theirs, so, and including Belize. Okay, so let's take a look at page, where are we? Did I get that back from you? Page, flip it over to culture. And it talks about people, language, religion, the festivals and foods. And we know which country has pretty big influence on the culture. Which country? Think about where most of the people are there. Eric?
African.
So Africa has a huge
influence on their culture. So what I want you to do while you're reading through culture is to find out how Caribbean culture reflects African influences. What types of things from the African culture are seen in Caribbean islands? Okay, take a look through that. Read and write this question down and answer it too. And we'll discuss it in a second. Dalton?
They reflect colonial heritage, also the religions people practice.
Okay, so what kind, so you say religions, what did they say about the type of religion that would have came from the African influence? What did they call that religion? Jimmy?
Traditional.
Well, they are traditional Africans, but then they kind of mentioned one specific one. Well, that came from the Europeans. Dylan? Creole is from the French. That's a language, actually. Jimmy? Santeria is how you say that. Santeria. It's a blended religion. It came from the Catholics, and which is European, and a traditional African religions kind of blended together. So Santeria. So that would have reflected the African culture. What else? What other specific came from the African influences? What else did you see for culture that came specifically from African? Take a look. I want you to be specific. Don't just say the people or things like that. What specifically do you see? Do you need some more time to read through it?
I didn't read festivals.
Oh, yeah, that's part of culture too. Harmon?
Food like yams.
Yams and okra. They also talked about pigs and things like that. Pig's tails, pig ears, snouts. Curry, which came from India, I suppose. So those are different types that come from the African influence. But what are some other cultures besides African that were brought over here to the Caribbeans? What other cultures were brought besides African? What kind of cultures? Jimmy?
Spanish, people speak Spanish.
Spanish, and they brought the language over. They speak Spanish. And what other countries brought over their culture? Dalton? The English. That language is brought, and also the Catholicism. Gavin? French. And what is the French dialect? The region of dialect that they speak of French in the Caribbean islands. What's that called? Harmon? Creole. French Creole, which is a dialect. Creole is a dialect, and it's a kind of different type of French. It's a regional variety of the language. So they speak French Creole, and mostly in Haiti they speak that. Okay, music, they talked about music a little bit, but if you look over on 73 about Caribbean music, in the culture, it says Caribbean islands have produced many unique styles of music. For example, Jamaica is famous as the birthplace of reggae. Merengue is the national music and dance of the Dominican Republic. Trinidad and Tobago is the home of steel drum and calypso music. The picture there to the right is a band of the Grenadines performed on steel drums. Steel drum bands can include as few as 4 or as many as 100 musicians. The instruments are actually metal barrels like kind used for shipping oil. The end of each drum is hammered into a curve shaped and with multiple grooves and bumps. Hitting the different size bumps results in the different notes there. So music is huge down in the Caribbean, the different styles, and that's huge for their culture. Okay, well, let's kind of take a look at these bigger countries and what it's like there today. Very similar from island to island because of the countries that came over, settled them. The difference, though, that you will see is the economies, the governments, and pretty much the geography, the layout of it. But a lot of it is the same. The history and the culture is very similar. Let's start with Puerto Rico. You take a look through Puerto Rico and find out a little bit more about Puerto Rico. Read the whole thing, please. About colonization. Which country came over and colonized Puerto Rico, Brock? That's okay, you can still take a look and see if you can find it. Toms?
Spanish.
The Spanish. It was a Spanish colony. What is it today, though? What's it today? Blake? Zach, I mean? What is it today? What do they call Puerto Rico today? Well, we call it Puerto Rico, but what is it? Cameron?
The Commonwealth.
It's a U.S. Commonwealth. And what is a Commonwealth? Gabby, what's a Commonwealth?
The Commonwealth is a self-governing territory associated with another country.
Yes, it's a self-governing territory, so Puerto Rico is self-governing, but they are associated with another country. It's owned by the United States, but it self-governs itself. So that makes the people of Puerto Rico what type of citizens? Brock?
U.S. citizens.
They are U.S. citizens, but they cannot vote for members of Congress. Right? They have no representation in Congress. Like Iowa, each state has representatives in Congress and senators in Congress. Puerto Rico does not have that. They talk about all the time deciding whether or not they want to be a state in the United States. They debate about it. They vote on it. The last time they voted, I think, was in the late 90s, and it was very close. I think it was 60% voted no to the 40% that voted yes. So, and others actually want to become their own independent country, not associated with the United States at all. Okay? But since the United States controls it, what are some things that the United States provides to Puerto Rico? Shane?
Isn't that why they don't have an army?
That's Costa Rica that doesn't have an army. Dalton?
Their economy is more developed than that of other Caribbean islands.
So we help them with economy quite a bit. We help their economy, and so their economy is much more developed than a lot of the other islands in the Caribbean because they get help from the United States, but they are still a very poor island, very low wages, unemployment is very high than other states in the United States. So they do have a better economy than most places in the islands, but not the best. Here is Puerto Rico. I'm circling it right now. That's Puerto Rico. If you went to Puerto Rico, you would be in the United States still.
So you would need a passport?
Correct.
You wouldn't?
Correct. You would technically not be traveling outside of the country because it's still the United States. A lot of people in Puerto Rico try to, well, because it's so poor, they want to leave and come to the United States to get better jobs so that they can find themselves homes and things like that. I'm going to look up some more information about Puerto Rico tonight to give you some more tomorrow. Someone asked about their leader there, so I'm going to look that up, and we'll talk a little bit more about Puerto Rico tomorrow. So actually, I'm going to stop you there because that's about where we're at first hour.